Hi, everyone. Welcome to a brand new episode of Film Talk with Jordan Ramirez. I am your host, Jordan Ramirez, and today we are joined by my very special guest. He is the host of An Evening at the Movies podcast series, which you can listen to on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or any other podcast you listen to. Please welcome to the show, Kasey Box. It's great to see you.
It's good to be here. I'm excited to be here and talk about this movie that we're going to talk about and have a good, deep, in-depth discussion. So thank you for
Okay.
having me.
Oh, yeah. Thank you so much. So, the movie that our guest Kasey has chosen is The Crow from 1994, directed by Alex Proyas, starring the late and great Brandon Lee, Michael Wincott, and of course, Ernie Hudson. So, when did you first see this film and why have you chosen this film for us?
I first saw this film in theaters when it first came out in 1994 while I was in high school.
Okay.
Um, it's the reason I brought this film up for discussion is because it's something that the subject matter kind of really resonates with me. Um, I tend to like things a little bit dark and gothic per se, and there's definitely a lot of darkness and gothicness, for lack of a better term, in this
Mm-hmm.
movie.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And there's a lot of deep thematic meaning as well. I mean, when you start getting into some of the other stuff as well, it's just, in my opinion, one of the greatest movies of all time.
That's good. So I did watch the film last night to sort of understand what was the whole process of this film. And from what I
Mhm.
understood, it was basically the story about a rock and roll musician and his girlfriend who were one night murdered. And after the murder, which took place a year, he is suddenly resurrected back from the dead with this supernatural crow, and he is for almost the entire majority of the film immortal or invincible. Like he cannot die. He has to avenge his girlfriend's death, and he has to bring justice to what happened on that very night a year
Mhm.
ago, which I thought was a pretty interesting concept. Uh, I was not aware, or maybe I was, but I may not remember, that it was based on a comic book series that was first published in 1989. And the character underwent different aliases, which we will discuss a little bit later in the episode.
Mhm.
Yeah. Um,
Um,
s no,
it
go ahead.
yeah. Well, I was just gonna say, the whole idea behind the comic book, the writer James Obar
Mm-hmm.
actually had at one point lost his girlfriend, wife. I don't remember what their relationship status was, but
Mm-hmm.
had died in a car accident, and a lot of the stuff with writing the comic book was his therapeutic release and helping get through the grieving process from losing her. So
Mm-hmm.
that's where a lot of that kind of stuff in the comic book slash eventually the movie came from.
Mm-hmm. But yeah, I did like this. I did like the film and the idea that you had the supernatural element, the gothic element. It's a dark film, as I watched it, and it is a pretty interesting picture to come from this era, since it may, well, when I first saw it, it felt like an unusual comic book film to be released in this decade. But again, this is before the 2000s and the 2010s when you would
Mhm.
have a wide barrage of comic book movies. But this one I thought was a pretty unusual dark comic book movie that feels in that tradition of dark and gothic, almost similar to I don't know if this would resonate like Tim Burton and his two pictures that came out around that same time, Batman and Batman Returns, in that same
Yeah.
mold or style.
No, it's very, I think back then in the early to mid part of the 90s, there was a lot of um, quote unquote anti-hero type stuff coming
Mm-hmm.
out. The Crow. I would probably lump Batman in that same category. Um,
Mm-hmm.
Anti-hero being somebody who's not as clean cut and wholesome as like Superman or Captain America or things of that nature.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, I think The Crow and Batman definitely fit into that mold. And then you also have other movies like Spawn and things of that nature that came out around the same time as well. So
Mm-hmm.
it was definitely a anti-hero type
Mm-hmm.
era in movie making.
Yeah, I definitely could see that. I mean, I was around when that whole era was around, but I never saw them when it was in theaters. Maybe when I saw them on VHS or on television later on.
Hmm.
But they were pretty interesting. It was a pretty interesting era when when Hollywood was basically making a lot of these comic book pictures. Some of them were trying to make anti-hero pictures that either worked, and others that were trying to make sort of interesting hero films, like from radio, like The Shadow was another one that came out, or Dick Tracy was a
Yeah.
comic strip, or The Phantom was another one that were either a hit or a miss. Like either they were successful or they were not successful when they first came out in theaters,
Hmm.
which I thought was a pretty interesting era going back to that period of the 1990s decade. So do you have at least besides the lead character who unfortunately this was like the best posthumous performance, do you have any other standout performances or sequences in that film in particular that you thought stood out to you the most?
Um, I actually really enjoyed Ernie Hudson's performance in the movie.
Mm-hmm.
You get a certain dark, broody, you know, tough guy appearance from Brandon Lee, but then like Ernie Hudson's character comes almost on the opposite side of it. He's kind of sort of laid back and reserved and but yet inquisitive about what's going on and trying to figure out, okay, it's been a year and all of a sudden all these people are starting to die that were, and then starts to put two and two together that, oh wait, they're linked to Brandon and, or not Brandon, but
Uh,
Eric and Shelley's
mm-hmm.
death. And you know, and all of that, and how their relationship, works together so that at the end of the day, Eric can ultimately achieve his mission in life and
Mm-hmm.
death. Um, the other one I would probably say that probably really connected with me was the T-Bird, the
Oh,
he's not necessarily the gang leader, but he's like number two in line behind
mm-hmm.
the ringleader.
Yeah.
Um, he's very slick and snarky and almost badass
Mm-hmm.
slash untouchable.
Mm-hmm.
So I think he pulled off those characteristics really well. And to the extent that every moment that he's on screen in the movie, and he's not on screen a whole lot before he's gone,
Mm-hmm.
but he makes you hate him every
Mm.
time that you see him on screen.
Yeah.
And it's
I
not just, ooh, I just kind of dislike it. No, you hate him
mm-hmm.
because you know exactly from the very beginning of the movie exactly what each and every one of those people did, not only to Eric, but also to Shelley with murdering, breaking into their house, raping her
Mm-hmm.
repeatedly. I mean, they're not, I mean, they're the evilest of evil bad guys.
Mm. I mean,
And
yeah. No, go ahead. What were you gonna say?
no, I'm just gonna say he definitely pulls off the whole I'm running the show when it comes to himself and Skank and Fun Boy and
Tintin.
Tintin and all the rest of them.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, not that they're all badasses in their own sense, but you definitely can tell that T-Bird is, for lack of a better metaphor, the straw that stirs the drink when it comes to helping make them the evil entities that they are.
Hmm. I actually want to say that I thought I also liked Ernie Hudson's performance in the film. I mean, this was a post Ghostbusters, like the first two Ghostbusters film after he made those films.
Mhm.
I thought this was also one of his best performances because this was like one of the few characters that I thought he played really well that felt so down to earth and almost sort of like a parental type figure, even though he
Yeah.
there's a sequence in the film when Eric is in his apartment and he asked if he still lives with his wife and he said not anymore, I'm getting a divorce. And I thought, well, I know that I like this character because he's human, and of course,
He's flawed.
yeah, he's flawed, of course. Yes. He's a flawed character, and he also, because like the detective in the film, who is, I thought, not a reliable character, but I thought his character, uh, he basically is like one of the few characters whom I sympathize with in the film, besides Eric's character in the film, of course.
Mhm.
But I always thought that he was like one of those characters that I thought was really powerful, on equal par with Brandon Lee in this film, of course. But I
Yeah.
also, yeah, but I also liked, but I thought the character of T-Bird, as you described earlier, was pretty interesting too. That he's sort of this slick guy. He has his own gang members, and they're just doing their job, of course, working for the main antagonist of the film, Mr. $2, played by Michael Wincott.
Yeah.
But yeah, which I thought was a pretty interesting performance in this film. But I also liked in the film the style of the style of the picture, that it was shot very much as I was watching it. It had like a sort of gothic feel, or almost sort of
Mhm.
comic book feel as I watched this picture, because it felt so unusual as I watched it. And I also liked the choice of using appropriate lighting. I did maybe get a shades of some red in the film, like some shades of red in the opening
Mhm.
of the film, the flashback sequences, or maybe whenever there's impending doom on some of the characters, that I thought was a pretty interesting choice.
Otherwise, yeah, it's very much a very dark, washed out, shadowy environment. And
Hmm.
then occasionally, like, especially, I think it's mainly with like your flashback sequences where you'll get flashes of red and the warm, vibrant colors
Hmm.
that kind of sort of help the viewer realize that, okay, this is not something that's of the same world as most of the movie. We're actually dealing with a
Hmm.
flashback or things of that nature, which, I mean, most people, I think, would put two and two together that that's what they're seeing. But at the same time, it definitely helps differentiate between the two worlds.
Hmm. And I also thought it was interesting that the idea of using the theme or motif of resurrection or death, or the idea of using the crow, even though it's in the title and it's the one thing that has kept him alive, it's pretty much like sort of the dominant animal motif in the picture so far, and pretty much I imagine in the comics as well, which I thought was an interesting choice to use, because when one thinks of crows or dark black birds, they usually think of something glooming or something foreboding or something gothic, that I think is appropriate for a film of this nature. That I thought
Yeah,
was,
like the Edgar Allan Poe poem.
yes, yes, and I imagined also in the film that there were like some quotations, some of them I am familiar with, that Eric recites when he enters to take out the members of the gang, which I thought was pretty interesting. Um,
Yeah, like the pawn shop scene when
yeah,
he shows up knocking at the door and ends
yeah.
up breaking through the door and makes the reference to
Uh, Poe, Edgar Allan
yeah,
Poe.
yeah, the
Mhm.
exact line is escaping me, but yeah.
Suddenly there was a rapping at my chamber door.
Yeah,
Hmm.
that one.
Yeah, so that one I thought was pretty interesting that you would use references from other literary or maybe like pieces of work that describe who this character is when he's sort of like the harbinger of doom or death or which I thought was
Yeah,
pretty interesting of his character. But I also thought it was another choice to have, and I read that this was added later, that the main narration of the film was provided by the character named Sarah, the child in the film. Like she is supposed she is the one of the supporting characters, but she's like also the main narration from the beginning and the ending
yeah,
of the film, which I thought was pretty interesting to have her as an interesting choice because um I thought her character was pretty interesting too because her mother in the film is a waitress, and in one scene we found out she's a drug addict, and she also is trying to be the best mother, which she never was, which I thought was I thought it was pretty interesting.
yeah. She's in the beginning of the movie. She's far from even a mediocre mother. She's actually a really horrible mother who
Hmm.
is all about um, getting high and um, sleeping with her boyfriend, Fun Boy,
Hmm.
also a member of T-Bird's gang.
Yeah.
But when Eric shows up to extract his revenge on
Hmm.
Fun Boy,
Yeah.
he basically has a heart-to-heart, very quick heart-to-heart discussion with Sarah's mom,
Hmm.
and he convinces her, morphine's bad for you. You need to knock the stuff off. You've got a
Hmm.
daughter out there running around on the streets all by herself.
Mm.
Go home and be a freaking mother and quit
Yeah. But
half-assing the job. And
yeah.
the next morning, when Sarah wakes up, her mom's in the kitchen, making eggs and all of that.
Hmm.
I mean, she's not even a good enough mom to remember how her daughter likes having her eggs cooked.
Yeah. um
And even to the point, Sarah's even so jaded at her mom, she sees her doing this and she kind of sort of just whatever.
yeah, yeah, I
And
am.
then she like wants to give up. And then Sarah realizes, oh, you actually are legitimately caring and trying to do something. Okay.
Yeah.
And she gives in and lets her do it.
Mhm. Yeah, exactly, because she wasn't the mother wasn't there for her in the beginning of the film. She always relied on Eric, Shelley, or Officer Albrecht, played in the film by Ernie Hudson, as if they were
Mhm.
like her close parental or guide figures, which I thought was pretty interesting as well. So
Yeah.
yeah.
I was gonna say Eric and Shelley basically were her saving grace until they died, and
Mm-hmm.
Officer Albright stepped in once they died and filled that role as well, so that up until her mom decided to step up and do her job,
Mm-hmm.
she consistently had somebody there for her to mentor her in the way that she deserved and needed to be mentored.
Yeah, exactly. So now I mentioned before that The Crow was the first film, and that I read that after this film was a huge success commercially and critically, they later did two or three more Crow films, which I had heard were either so-so or not okay, or maybe it depends on who I'm talking to. But
Yeah.
did you see the follow-ups to this film, and what was your take on those pictures?
Um, I saw all of them.
Mm-hmm.
I saw the TV series.
Mm-hmm.
I probably will be seeing the remake that comes out in a couple of months,
Yeah.
starring Bill Skarsgård.
Yeah. I was going to bring that up, but
Okay. Well, we can save on that until you're ready for it. But you,
mhm.
I'm not as much a fan of the sequels that came after.
Mm-hmm.
Um, to me, the first movie and the performance by Brandon Lee were so great
Mm-hmm.
that you can't recapture lightning in a bottle a second time.
Mm-hmm.
So it almost felt kind of disrespectful to me in a
Mm-hmm.
way,
Mm-hmm.
but I get why Hollywood tried to do it. Um, I just don't think it worked.
Yeah. I
So,
mean, yeah. I read that some of the reviews were mixed to negative for the sequels. Like some of them said they were not good.
mhm,
They didn't really do anything different. They were just almost formulaic or just maybe repeating from the first film is what I read.
it really was.
Hmm. Yeah, so I thought it was a pretty interesting thing to look up. But you mentioned the TV series. So when did the TV series air? Because I may not remember seeing it.
It was 1998.
Hmm.
It was called The Crow Stairway to Heaven.
Okay. So I guess I might not have seen the series. I guess when it first aired. So yeah, I mean
It
I
was
thought
different.
yeah. But I I usually try to avoid watching sequels unless someone tells me that it may be on par with the first film.
Mhm,
But if it's a sequel that is not as good as the first film, or maybe trying to be a repetition of the first film, and I may have seen some films that try to do that, then I say I would prefer watching the first rather than watching what comes next,
mhm.
because I think it's better that way.
Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, that's one thing that so I know you have your podcast called An Evening at the Movies. And
Mhm.
I think I might have looked up some of the episodes that you might have done recently. So what is it that you try to do that's different from, like, let's say other movie podcasts that tries something different with their niche?
So, um, what myself and my co-host Amanda try and do with an evening at the movies is we try and create an environment where it's basically like you have us being friends or us and one or two other friends that are sitting down and just having a friendly heart-to-heart conversation about a movie.
Mm-hmm.
Um, So it's very much just discussion, discussion, discussion. And then at the end of each episode, we give each other a chance to review and rate the movie on a scale of 1 to 5
Mm-hmm.
so that our amazing listeners can have a chance to, if they haven't seen the movie that we're discussing, hopefully we're giving them the information that they need to come up with a educated decision as
Mm-hmm.
to whether or not they decide they want to go and check out this movie and
Mm-hmm.
watch it.
Okay.
So, I mean, the show's 3 years old. We've done at this point over 200 episodes.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a lot of material out there for people to go through, and it's not um, centralized to one specific genre either. We try and balance it out as much as we can between horror, comedy, drama, you know,
Mm-hmm.
what action, whatever the case may be. So
Mm-hmm.
there's something out there for everybody who loves movies to check out. So
Mm-hmm. Oh, okay. So I know that we mentioned this before, but when it comes to remakes of films that maybe I enjoy or maybe that somebody else enjoys, sometimes one would say they want to see what's different about the remake, or they want to say they want to see maybe something, an improvement on the film that they enjoyed, but maybe they want to see how they do it. So, what are your thoughts on the remake coming in a few months with Bill Skarsgård as the lead?
um, I hope that they can bring something else to the table when it comes to presenting the story in a fresh manner.
Mm-hmm.
If it ends up being something where they just basically took the first movie and are retelling it in the same exact fashion that they did,
Mm-hmm.
what, 30-ish
30,
years ago,
yeah, 30
30
years
years
ago.
ago,
30 years ago.
then that's something I'm not going to be a big fan of. And uh, there will come a day when we probably will sit down and discuss the remake on an evening at the movies.
Mm-hmm.
And with this movie being one of my top three favorite movies of all time,
Mm.
um, I probably won't have a nice thing to say about it
Mm-hmm.
if that's how they're going to do it. Um,
Okay.
like you were saying, if you're going to do a remake, do something that is going to bring something fresh to the table and not just, you know, reiterate the same thing over and over and over again.
Mm.
So
Yeah.
I don't care if it's The Crow, Halloween, any of the other movies that have been remade in the last 20 something years. Just
Mm-hmm.
give me something new, give me something fresh, give me something different so that it's not like, okay, I'm watching the same movie as the first one.
Yeah.
Why not just go watch the original? Why am I watching a retelling of the original story?
Mm-hmm. I mean, that's my thoughts exactly. I have that same thing whenever I see a studio trying to remake something that they already own in their library,
Mhm.
and then they try to sometimes they would always try to make the cast diverse, or they would try to retell it but with different themes or scenes that are newly added, that I'm like, I'm not sure how I would enjoy this, because I mean the original, if it's an original film that I loved but may somewhat be flawed, I say I prefer you don't do that, because I mean it may be flawed on its own terms, but I don't need somebody correcting it. I just want it to be just the way it is. Um, that's
There's a
just
reason why the originals are classics.
mm-hmm.
And if you're going to try and redo it, then to me, you're messing with the formula that made the original a classic.
Yeah,
Leave classics alone and let them be.
yeah, exactly. I mean, besides those types of movies, they also remake like something that's in the public domain for many, many years into movies as well, which I thought, I mean, it's okay if you remake the same fairy tale novel or play as many times as you want if it's done differently.
Mhm.
But if it's a film that I enjoy or maybe somebody else enjoys, I'm like, if you got to do it right, you have to make sure that it doesn't feel like you're taking something that I enjoyed and then trying to do a spin on it that makes me say, okay, maybe you didn't guys read the film carefully because you were trying to do it based on what you think makes sense to you.
Mhm.
That's just something that to me I always find to be one of my main irritations when it comes to remaking something that I enjoy.
Yeah,
Um,
exactly.
mhm. So getting back to that, so I know you mentioned that this was in your top three. So what were the other two films that you meant that you didn't mention that were your favorites?
Uh, my first one, well, the one that generally goes back and forth with The Crow as to which one is number one and which one's number two
Mm-hmm.
is the second movie I ever saw in the movie theater when I was a kid,
Mm-hmm.
all the way back in, I think it was 1980 when it was re-released,
Mm-hmm.
and that was Star Wars,
The
Star Wars
first.
franchise. Well,
Oh,
the original trilogy as a whole.
okay. So,
So
go ahead.
that, and then 1999's The Green Mile as
Oh,
well.
yeah, wonderful
I'm
film.
I'm a huge Stephen King fan,
Mm,
books and movies,
mm,
and that movie emotionally connected with me in so many different ways, both the
mm,
book and the movie,
mm,
that I can't just, yeah, it's amazing movie.
mm.
And then I also have my honorable mention being The Wizard of Oz. I grew
Oh,
up watching that movie as a kid,
mm,
so it would probably be my, you know, number 3.5 on my
Mm.
top three. So
Yeah, excuse me. I mean, I do like Wizard of Oz, and I have seen Green Mile, and I also enjoyed my God, and I also enjoyed your other favorite Star Wars.
Star
I
Wars.
mean, yeah, the first one from 77.
Hmm.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I've seen those, and I mean, I tried not to talk too much about it. I mean, for me, if I just want to watch the Star Wars films, I either watch like the originals or maybe, and people may turn me off if I say this, like the prequels. If people say don't watch the prequels, they may not be as good as the originals. I'm like, to me, they're so. It
Yeah,
depends.
I would agree.
Yeah. Okay. So before we wrap things up on the show, so do you have any last statements or anything that you want to say about this film for those who have either never seen it or maybe want to watch the original before they go out and see the remake?
Um, yeah, definitely 100%. If anybody listening to this hasn't seen the original, I highly recommend you go and see it. It may be dark, it may be gothic, it may kind of sort of be creepy and or violent,
Mm-hmm.
but there really is a whole lot of good quality life lessons to be taken from the movie. So I highly recommend uh, giving it a shot and going in and sitting down and watching it with an open mind. Um, Definitely, if you have not seen it, though, I would watch this version before you run out and go see the version that's coming out here in a few weeks with Bill Skarsgård.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Nothing against Bill, but I think having this as the Brandon Lee version of the movie as your basis or your foundation,
Mm-hmm.
and then going into watching the Skarsgård version when it comes out will definitely allow you to have a solid foundation to build any kind of appreciation for the entire story.
Mm.
So definitely highly recommend checking it out. I can't repeat it enough, but check it out, check it out, check it out.
Okay. So I'll put in my last statement before we wrap things up. So
Mhm.
the one thing I enjoyed about this film, even though it was, I thought, one of his best performances before his passing, was it almost felt appropriate because even though it is about a man who was resurrected from the dead and later, I hate to spoil it, becomes no longer invincible, that it's almost like it's a movie featuring an actor as if he was a ghost, and if he was brought back from the dead and suddenly went and suddenly is no longer mortal or is no longer immortal, which I thought was I wouldn't say appropriate, but I thought it was pretty interesting, yet at the same time almost very surreal to watch it, which I thought was pretty which I thought was a pretty
Mhm.
interesting choice. But yes, so go check this film out from 1994, The Crow, starring Brandon Lee, Michael Wincott, Ernie Hudson, uh, directed by Alex Proyas, and based on the graphic comic books from 1989 by James O. Did I say James O'Barr? James.
Yes, James
Okay,
O'Barr.
yeah. So yeah. And where can my listeners find you before we wrap things up?
An Evening at the Movies can be found on wherever you get your podcast listening fix, Apple Podcasts, Google, Spotify, um, yeah, wherever you get that, as well as you can find us on YouTube as well. Each and every Wednesday morning, we drop at least one new episode a week. For the next couple of months, though, we will be dropping 2 episodes a week. So you can definitely have a wealth of listening and watching stuff to check out as well. But yeah, YouTube, just look for An Evening at the Movies. And then Spotify, Apple, Google, wherever. You can also search for An Evening at the Movies as well. And we are on all forms of social media. Just again, search for the um, title of the show, An Evening at the Movies, and you can link up with us that way and stay informed as to what's coming up each and every week. So,
Okay. Well, thank you for being on the podcast.
mhm,
And I loved having this discussion with you. And maybe in the future we could talk more about some of your maybe two of the other favorites that you mentioned. So
mhm.
you're always welcome to come back on the show. And it's been a real pleasure.
Thank you very much for having me.
Okay, this has been Film Talk with Jordan Ramirez with my special guest Kasey Box, host of An Evening at the Movies, which, as he mentioned, you can listen to on Wednesday morning on various social media platform, on various podcast platforms, including Apple, Spotify, YouTube, and on Google. And as always, I hope we can meet each other soon, Kasey, and it's been a real pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay. And I hope we will see again. We'd see each other again soon. Okay.
Yes. Have
Okay.
a good day.
Have a good day. Bye.